After working an 8-hour shift, plus an additional 4 hours of overtime, Jonathan Fremont had just arrived home. Jonathan was employed by the local Caterpillar dealership as a diesel mechanic. He was one of their best mechanics, but he wasn't a foreman. Jonathan didn't want to be a foreman, he was content not to be one. His ideal job would have been the one he was doing. With firefighters battling for significant forest fires and an unknown number of smaller fires that were starting all over the place, things had been extremely hot and intense. Everywhere there had been equipment failure, Jonathan was needed nearly all the time. Jonathan had been working extra hours since the middle of July, and the end of August, when the kids were supposed to return to school, was quickly approaching. Throughout the summer, both on weekdays and weekends, Jonathan had been rising early and returning home late. Jonathan was content with all of the overtime he was getting, so he wasn't complaining. Working overtime made Jonathan happy every time. Time meant money, and Jonathan needed money after he and Susan had purchased an expensive ranch house with 4 bedrooms, 2.5 bathrooms, and a 2-car garage 2 years prior. The ranch house was situated on a sizable lot in a nice neighborhood. Now that Cindy, Joey, and Nancy were older, they required separate rooms and spaces. Even though everything was going to blow up, Jonathan was still making a great living. Though exhausted, Jonathan was content. The funds were required. Being able to afford the pricey house made Jonathan happy, no, proud. Being a good provider for his family made him feel good. Jonathan was devoted to and proud of his entire family. Jonathan would have said he had the best wife and kids anyone could ask for if someone had asked. Not that they weren't dealing with issues of their own. Just like any other couple, they had them. Nothing major, though, just minor issues like Jonathan developing an excessive amount of a beer gut on him and Susan gaining a little too much weight after having the 3 small children. Susan bemoaned the fact that Jonathan would rather stay home or go fishing than attend the couple's parties that friends and neighbors would organize. They both wouldn't have claimed to have had wonderful sex lives. Maybe a little wilder sex with less making love would have been what Jonathan would have wanted. Would Susan have objected to Jonathan's increased flirting, foreplay, and attention? Those are the kinds of issues that irritate you slightly but never become significant enough to start a fight. Both Jonathan and Susan appeared to be happy. Everything seemed too quiet in the house when Jonathan walked in. If anything, the sound of 3 kids playing would have welcomed him. It was still too early, and they shouldn't have gone to sleep yet. It was too late, even for summer, for them to be over at the neighbors playing. For a brief moment, Jonathan wondered if he had forgotten anything. Did Susan let him know that they would be spending the night with someone, perhaps their grandparents? They were obviously not inside the house. But Susan was. With her hands clasped together on the dining room table, Susan was seated in the far corner, gazing thoughtfully at Jonathan through a worried, melancholic, and reflective expression on her face. Jonathan thought for a split second that she appeared to have been crying. Her eyes appeared red. Her first words were, "Jonathan, there's something we have to talk about," as she lowered her eyes to her hands. Jonathan felt a lurch and flutter in his stomach. He had only ever seen that expression on Susan's face once. The day Susan had told him his father had passed away unexpectedly from a heart attack, she had been sitting in that exact same chair and said those exact words. Jonathan felt his knees weaken as he remembered. He took out an oak chair and took a seat across from Susan at the table. He was speechless and could only cast a doubtful glance at Susan, but she was averting his gaze. With a distant expression in her eyes, Susan was pondering and thinking. Jonathan sensed Susan's wish to remain silent, Susan's desire to be somewhere other than where she was evident to him. Susan was both in favor of and against this conversation. There were butterflies fighting in his stomach. Susan spoke with a melancholic, almost mournful tone while studying her still folded hands and avoiding looking at Jonathan. "Jonathan is aware of my love for him. I love you more than any man in the world, as you are aware. You realize how much you mean to me, don't you?" Hardly speaking, Jonathan's mouth went dry as he swallowed. "Yes." Lifting her gaze to Jonathan, Susan studied him, looking for a deeper response than that one word. "Jonathan, more than ever, you have to believe that. This is really important, and I have some things to tell you about. You have to understand how much I genuinely care about you, how essential you are to me, and how vital we are to one another. You must have faith in us. No matter how you feel afterward or how deeply you are hurt, you simply must. This is more crucial than it has ever been. I genuinely adore you. Susan's voice trembled as she spoke those final words one after the other like they were complete sentences. Jonathan was perspiring cold sweat down his back at this point. His hands were shaking a little. He was unable to believe what he was thinking. Jonathan's mind was racing with 1,000 possible conclusions due to the atmosphere created by Susan's words, expression, and anticipation. He was unable to push the memories of his father's passing from his thoughts, emotions, or awareness. They were all a part of him. Jonathan had a gut feeling that this would be one of those times when everything would change. Life would never be the same after whatever Susan wanted to tell him. It seemed as though time had stopped. Susan sat thinking about Jonathan, but her gaze refused to meet his perplexed, inquiring gaze. They looked at Jonathan only in contemplation. The only sound in the room was the ticking of the wall clock. In the quiet stillness, you could almost hear the creaking of the house. Her words came then, rolling and rambling, sometimes soft and barely audible, sometimes hard and loud, almost violent with passion, like the snapping crack of gunshots breaking the stillness. Her lips trembling, her voice faltering, she said, "Jonathan, I'm not just worried that you won't understand this if you hear this from someone else. For my own mental health, I feel compelled to inform you of this. This is no longer how I can continue. I've held on to this for far too long. I've wanted to tell you for more than a year now. I simply can't contain it any longer. It would be wrong to keep it from you. Hiding it causes pain and is making things feel wrong. That is not how it ought to be. For me, this is too significant and valuable of a moment. We've talked about this for far too long now. We have determined that there is no other option. You wouldn't be able to understand if I didn't tell you and give you an explanation. You could only have negative thoughts if you learned about this or heard it from someone else. You would act foolishly, hurting me, hurting you, hurting us. I would prefer that you not misunderstand. You must comprehend. To ensure that you comprehend, we must have an honest and open discussion about this. All I can do is hope, no, pray, that you will love me sufficiently to comprehend. I simply don't know what will happen if you don't. I suppose all I have to do is put my faith and trust in you and your love for me. I have to have an impact. There isn't an alternative. She let out a sigh and lowered her shoulders, accepting whatever was going to happen. But, for a brief while, the only sound in the room was the clock ticking. Susan just stared thoughtfully at her hands, her shoulders still lowered in surrender, instead of continuing. Susan lifted her head once, twice, thrice, opening her mouth to speak, but she quickly dropped it and remained silent. Eventually, slowly, as though every word had to be wrenched out of her, she said, "Jonathan, I've been seeing someone for the past year." "A man?" Her gaze was now fixed on Jonathan, defiant, bold, demanding, defensive, and waiting for his response all at once. She was now prepared to confront Jonathan with an honest and open defense of her adultery. Her initial timid strides had been made. She was unable to hide anymore. Jonathan is a really nice, kind, understanding, and compassionate man who has suffered a great deal of hurt and is in need of my love and care. Before I met him, he had lost his wife in an accident the year before. Their vehicle flipped over on the highway, killing her. Even though it wasn't his fault, he felt terrible about himself because he was driving. He was severely depressed and engaged in self-harm. He still experiences occasional depression even now, after all this time and all of my love and attention. Jonathan experienced vertigo. Had he really heard her right? Was she betraying him? Had she betrayed him and made a fool of him? He was so disoriented that he was not even aware of the pain, feeling as though a single blow had rendered him numb. Now his mouth filled with gummy sludge instead of saliva. I'm still struggling to fully understand Susan's words. You're telling me that for the last year you have been cheating on me? You have been running around with some other guy? You're telling me that you've thrown away our marriage and our marriage vows just to get some strange? You're telling me that you don't care enough about the kids or me, you just want to have your thrills, your fun and excitement. Susan's eyes flared, burning, her face hard and harsh, and her voice rising, shaking in anger. Jonathan, shame on you. Do you think so little of me? Do you love me so little that you think I am some nymphomaniac, a harlot, and a walking street? Right now, I'm so ashamed of you to think that you could care and love me so little. Right now, I am so disappointed. I don't think I've ever been more disappointed in you before. How could you ever think something like that of me, your own wife and the mother of your children? Supposed to love, honor, and cherish me, those were our wedding vows, Jonathan. Susan snapped those last two sentences out, intending each word as a slap in Jonathan's face. Then she stopped, her face turning to one side, attempting to calm herself. Nothing was said for a while. Then, in Susan's eyes, were the emotions of love and consideration to be seen. A small sigh of remembered joy and passion passed her lips. Believe me, he's not a bad man, Jonathan. This isn't something like you're thinking, like you're worried about. This isn't about just sex. This isn't about cheating or lying, running around uncaringly. This isn't about being immoral or immoral. This is about love and caring for someone deeply. This is about me helping and giving someone something of myself that someone needs very badly, something that he can't do without. This is about receiving something in return that is very precious to me, something that I can hold in my heart and memories when I'm old, ugly, and grey. Something for when no one cares, loves, wants, or needs me anymore. Yes, there is sex, and the sex is good. A smile crossed her lips, her eyes grew distant. Sometimes the sex is even great, but it's not about sex. It's about love. It's about being loving and attentive to the needs and desires of those you love. That is why the sex is so good, so great. Jonathan's body buckled in his seat, his stomach cramping from the massive blow. His awareness only centered on that one thought: Susan loved this man. She was going to leave him for this man. He was losing her to him. That was the reasoning behind this whole talk. Had she already packed her bags? Or maybe she had packed Jonathan's. With tears forming in his eyes, bent forward in pain so far he could barely look into Susan's eyes, he managed to ask, "You love him?" That was all his body, his voice, allowed. His mind expressed the thoughts in his eyes. Susan understood this was the very reason she had taken this agonizing course of action upon herself. Thinking, knowing that Jonathan would only misunderstand and think wrongly, respond wrongly. Yet still, Susan answered honestly and proudly, "Yes, I do love him. I love him very much. He is very important to me. He means a lot to me." Then, in the most tender, gentle, and caring voice she could muster, "But I love you too. I've never stopped loving you, and I never want or will stop loving you. I just love you both, each one of you differently, for different reasons." Looking forcefully and deeply into Jonathan's eyes, wanting, needing him to understand, she continued, "I'm never going to leave you for him or anyone else, Jonathan. Please, never think that. You are my husband, the father of my children, and the love of my life, my soulmate." Then, with a sorrowful sigh, looking out the window into the nameless infinite beyond, "Someday I know that it will be over between him and me. He is too young for me ever to consider as a partner. In time, he will grow past his need for me and find someone who will become his soulmate and partner. Then I will step aside, only cherishing our memories." Gasping for breath now, finally rage forming, building up within him, who is he? Where is the son of a? Jonathan stood up out of his chair, pacing the open area between the kitchen and the dining room. Her eyes and face cold, ever so cold, severe, and insensitive. "Jonathan, who he is none of your concern or business. What we do, how we make love, or when we make love, what we do together is none of your business. That is between only him and me. You are not a part of what happens between us. What happens between us is only about him and me. You are not a part of that, just the same as he is not a part of our life together. Never again ask me such questions. I will not answer you." Jonathan slammed his fist against the wall, the plasterboard cracking underneath his fist. How in the hell could you ever think that I would accept such a situation? Are you crazy? Do you seriously expect me to willingly share you with this? On her cold, severe, and insensitive facial expression now grew a mocking smile. What are you going to do, Jonathan? Divorce me? I don't think so, Jonathan. Do you know what a divorce would mean for you? Maybe you should check out your options with a lawyer before you go spouting off any more stupidity. This is a no-fault divorce state, Jonathan. He is a divorce lawyer, so we know very well the outcome. We've talked this part out completely. If you divorce me now, Jonathan, I will be taking you to the cleaners. I will protect my children and me first and foremost. Your welfare will not be a concern of mine. You would be paying me not only child support, you would be paying me alimony, the court costs, my car payment, and this house. Not even with the amount of overtime you have been making lately would you be able to afford anything but a cardboard box to live in. You'd be sleeping in your car or at work and eating Spam and macaroni and cheese for at least the next 10 to 12 years. Her expression then softened some yet still remained formidable, her body leaning aggressively forward off the back of her chair and over the table. Have you given the children any thought? How do they fit into your plans? Do you know how a divorce would affect them? Have you considered what effect your relationship with them would have if you were not here for them? Leaning back into her chair, crossing her arms and laying her hands onto her upper arms, the mocking smile returning to her lips, no, Jonathan, divorce is not an option. Taken aback and realizing how bitterly Susan had stacked the deck against him, Jonathan felt the need to at least gain a point against her. What if I were to cheat on you? How would you feel about that? That would be fair, wouldn't it? With an angry smirk on his face, he added, you know what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Angry flames glaring at Jonathan, she answered quickly, too quickly to have not already thought that option through. Don't be so stupid, Jonathan. Take a long look at yourself. You're not 18 and young anymore. You're balding on top, your belly is starting to hang over your belt. You're a middle-aged married man with 3 children and a wife to support. Who would even consider having an affair or even a one-night stand with a man like you? Women our age want sincerity, comfort, compassion, and security, or they want erotic sensuality from interesting men who can seduce them towards passions they have never known before. None of these can you provide. No, again, Jonathan, if you go out chasing skirts in bars and embarrass and shame me for being your wife, I will divorce you. For long moments, both of them stayed only angrily staring at each other. It was then Susan's eyes that first broke their battle stance, her eyes breaking from his as her head turned again towards the window and out into contemplative infinity. Time slowly ebbed away in silence, only the ticking of the clock and Jonathan's heavy, erratic breathing could be heard. Quietly, slowly, her attention turned back to Jonathan, her eyes no longer cold and harsh, but rather soft, tender, and loving. Jonathan, for a moment, was taken aback, his eyes and emotions forced to change because of hers. Jonathan, this doesn't have to be this way. My love for you hasn't changed any. I am still your loving wife, just like I always was. He hasn't taken anything from you, not a single thing. I'm still here for you, and I always will be. She continued, if you love me enough, what is between him and me should not change our love for each other. Maybe even with time, our love can grow stronger and better because of all this. Everything that happens now between us is up to you. I'm still open to you. I'm still here for you. I'm trying not to burn any bridges between us. I'm even trying to open new and old ones back up. With a deep, sorrowful sigh, she dropped her eyes from Jonathan back to her hands, once again clasped and resting on the table. I would hope that if you loved me enough, you would understand what this means to me and be happy for me. Tears starting to form in her eyes, she looked back to Jonathan, her eyes and her expression almost questioning, begging. I don't know what else I can say or tell you. I only thought that your love for me would be strong enough for you to look past your male ego and selfish desires and want the best for me. I'm sorry if you can't do that. I'm very sorry. She sobbed, putting a hand in front of her mouth, and jumped from her chair, running from the dining room and down the hall towards the bedroom. The door behind her closed with a slam. Jonathan stiffly walked into the kitchen and pulled a bottle of Jim Beam out of one of the cabinets. Moving back into the dining room, he tipped the full bottle up and drank, letting the liquor flow down his throat in 3, then a final 4, heavy gulps. Sitting back in the same chair he had before, he stared for a moment at the corner where Susan had been sitting. Lifting the open bottle once again, he toasted, "Here's to my loving wife. Here's to my loving adulterous wife." Then, with the bottle pressed to his lips, he allowed another 3 heavy gulps of whiskey to slide down his throat. Jonathan normally never got angry drunk, but this night wasn't normal, was it? The more Jonathan drank, the angrier and more depressed he seemed to be getting. Normally quiet, Jonathan was becoming very verbal. Angry, impressive thoughts and alcohol were allowing him to not only become very verbal, but also very abusive in his language. At one point, Jonathan got up and staggered, bouncing off the walls as he walked towards the closed bedroom door. Finding it locked, he slammed his fist against it. "God damn it, Susan! You're not only with others, you're locking me out of my own goddamn bedroom. I can't even be a man in my own house anymore. You've turned me into a cuckold and a wimp that isn't allowed to sleep in his own goddamn bedroom anymore. What's next? You going to bring him into our own bedroom? Is he going to be sleeping now in my bed, in my place, instead of me? Is that your next move, or has that already happened?" Jonathan staggered back into the dining room, but not before calling out once more, "Susan, you're a goddamn whore. I hope you know that. I never should have married your whore ass." About a half hour later, Susan walked back out of the bedroom. She was dressed and had a small overnight case of clothing in one hand. Intending at first not to stop, she did, though, for a moment. She looked, staring in pity at Jonathan, now completely inebriated, his head on the table, the bottle of Jim Beam mostly empty and tipped over in front of him. Just before she turned to leave, Jonathan saw her and raised his head for a moment. "Going to your lover?" Susan did not answer him at first, but turned and walked away, opening the door. "Yes, Jonathan, I'm going to him tonight. You're so angry and drunk, I'm afraid of what you could do. You've said enough cruel things to last me a lifetime. If I hear any more, I'll only learn to hate you. I only pray that tomorrow you'll think differently and that we can talk." Jonathan slept for a time, then awoke, pulling the bottle once more to his lips before falling back asleep. Once during the night, he awoke and felt even halfway sober. He stumbled into the bedroom and sat on the bed, feeling so alone. The full volume and consequences of the previous evening swept over him. He cried in deep, hysterical sobs that did not seem to end. "Is this the end for me? Will I be able to live after this? Wife, divorce, kids, she has already driven a knife through my heart. Now, if I divorce her, she will drive a knife through my pocket as well. Threatening me with consequences means she has planned this. They have planned this. So he, a divorce lawyer, she is going to pay and pay dearly." The next morning, Jonathan was still in the kitchen when Susan walked in. "How was your night, honey? Did your lover overcome his self-harm depression? A nice sex session does that to a man. So you are now going to treat me like that?" Susan sneered. "What you sow, so shall you reap. I'll be a little late, so in case you want to go to your lover and have a session, make it quick. We cannot afford a babysitter." Susan had tears in her eyes. She deserves more tears, Jonathan thought to himself. That day, Jonathan called his mother and explained his situation. His mother offered all the support that he needed. "I'll call you soon," Jonathan said, then hung up. He now needed a plan. He went to his garage and, after a few hours, informed his manager that he would not be doing overtime for a few days and would leave on time. He then made a few very important phone calls. That evening, Jonathan reached home and found Susan in the kitchen. Susan looked at Jonathan and smiled. Jonathan ignored her and walked into his bedroom. Susan came to the bedroom and put her hand on Jonathan. He got up and left the room. Susan called out, "How long do you think you will stay away from me? You have no way out of this. You cannot win, so accept it and live with it. I told you I love you, and I'll grow old with you." "Not in this lifetime," Jonathan sneered and walked out of the house. He walked the streets and went to the broken glass bar. It had been ages since he had gone to a bar. He went in and had a few shots of his favorite scotch. He walked out, looked at the sky, and saw the moon. He kept walking, not knowing where he was going. He did not have any thoughts in his mind. He was free, at least for a few seconds. It was not long before the images of his kids flowed into his eyes. He was crying. It was at this moment that he had a moment of light. He no longer wanted to cry. He no longer wanted to be a victim of a cheating wife or any lover. His moment did not last long, as soon his heart filled with rage. Jonathan went home. He found Susan waiting for him in the kitchen. "Where were you? You left your phone. I thought I lost you." "How does it matter?" "I already lost you," Jonathan shot back. "You are my husband. What will I do without you?" Jonathan then took his car keys and asked Susan to follow him. Susan followed him to his car. Jonathan got in and asked Susan to get in. "Where are we going?" Susan asked. "Wait and watch." Jonathan drove his car to her lover's house. Susan was now panicking. What will happen when her husband meets her lover? The house was expensive and large. Quite a catch. "How did you snag this?" "He is rich." "Why don't you move in with him?" Susan was now crying and begging Jonathan. Then Jonathan grabbed her arm and dragged her from the vehicle. "Either you come with me willingly, or I'll be more than happy to drag your carcass in there." Susan chose to follow since she had never seen him acting that way. Jonathan walked in after opening the door. Susan was taken aback to see the door open. Susan entered and discovered her lover, 32-year-old lawyer Mike Patterson, strapped to a chair, his eyes swollen and blood seeping from a gash on his head. With a gasp, Susan covered her mouth with her hands. Behind him were two men. "Oh my God, what happened here?" She attempted to move toward him. "You take one step further, and I will make sure you are replacing him with the same makeup that he has," Jonathan grumbled. "Now, Mr. Patterson, please explain to my wife what happened to your wife." "She divorced me and left me when I cheated on her," he said. "Where does she live now?" "London," was his response. "Do you have any depression?" "No," he responded. "Fantastic." He asked, "Why did you lie to my wife so that you could have sex with her?" Jonathan looked over at Susan. He was allegedly receiving treatment for his depression. He just needed to spend time with you, he didn't need your love. "You really are a moron, boy." Susan burst into tears. "Now, Mr. Patterson, this is what's going to happen. There is no way to verify that I was here because all of the cameras in the house have been turned off and their recordings have been erased. It's true that I never touched you. It was done by someone else. You'll take care of my divorce paperwork and make sure my dear soon-to-be ex-wife doesn't receive anything from me. She is unfit to have custody of my child, so that should not happen. You're going to leave town the moment my divorce is finalized and never come back. My boys will return during this time if you choose to play and try to call the police on me or in any other way ruin me. We will track you down across the globe and see to it that you wind up in a worse predicament than you are in at the moment. Are we in agreement about that?" Mr. Patterson gave a nod. Jonathan faced Susan once more. "Your boyfriend is going to make sure you are not around me anymore. After you get home, you'll pack your belongings and move out. I'll give you until the next morning because it's late at night. You're going to give your kids a call and let them know you're not going to live with them again." In protest, Susan said, "I'll do no such thing." "You will, of course. There's no getting out of this. Assume that you will never win and learn to live with it. I will not grow old with you, and I do not love you." I left her with no options. I took her hand and turned to leave. As soon as I made the call, the two men, my younger brothers, came to my aid. They had both served time in prison. The strategy was clear: confront the threat head-on, using a cold, hard reality check and a peek into the repercussions of her actions rather than words. I had avoided using violence all my adult life because I had never been a fan of it. Susan made it very evident that she was self-centered and didn't care about my children or her husband, just her own sensual desires. She clearly told me that she doesn't belong in a real man's heart, she belongs in the streets. She is not deserving of affection, deference, or compassion. She will get none from me. She made me think of my vows to treasure and value her in our marriage, but I had forgotten to be a faithful wife. I married thee with this ring. I pledge to love and cherish you forever and offer you my heart and soul. I pledge to be your devoted companion, to stick by your side no matter what, and to love and support you forever. You must refrain from adultery. She forgot, but I won't until she's my wife. You are inviting trouble when you put a real man up against the wall and tell him he can't win. A true man will fight back instead of just cowering down and taking it. He'll simply pass right by you. My darling wife followed suit. She made the worst choice by telling me she would take my kids away after pushing my back against the wall and threatening to suck me dry. A man can be threatened with terrible things, but you never threaten to take his children away. I drove back home after saying my brother's gratitude. Susan packed up her belongings and departed early in the morning. Despite his success as a lawyer, Lover Boy is ultimately just a human. People can feel fear, lust, and love. Fear is a strong emotion that has the ability to transform someone into a monster or a wimp. That made him a wimp and me a monster. He feared physical pain, I feared for my children. I was asked to take a week off by my lover boy. He needed to get over the beating and cover up the evidence of his terrifying evening. I agreed to that on the understanding that he would bring a bottle of Jack Daniels to my house every evening. He was willing to pay the small price. After 6 months, I had my divorce. Boy in love departed from the town. Susan, my former spouse, had already moved out to live with her mother. She was dating a Texas accountant, as far as I knew. Gosh, I could care less. I was only concerned with my 3 children. All I wanted to do was watch them develop into decent people. If you've made it this far, listener, please hit the subscribe button. It will be very beneficial.